In that illustration that's done by Vincenzo Poggi, that's an illustration of Estaldi. I don't have a picture of him. He continues, there was this poor paralytic. He couldn't feed himself or put himself to bed, so they put him with the mental criminals. After 2 days, he came back to his cell, preferring to be unable to do anything rather than to be with the crazy criminals. One of the doctors that was with us, who was always low-key, would scream all night, banging his fists against the steel door. Interning us was exaggerated. The moral torture is undescribable. For Saverio Biffi, who was a cornerstone of the Italian colony, Bordeaux jail was not the place for the internees. He felt that they were humiliated and treated as criminals. Now this begs the question, did the government overprescribe security? Is it necessary to give 10 pills when only 1 is needed? There were about 200 Italian associations, mutual aid societies, and village-based groups in Montreal during the 20s and 30s. Some members used the clubs for relief, to buy insurance, and receive medical services. The Casa d'Italia served the needs of the colony and played a much-needed role in bringing Montrealers of all classes together. The 2 biggest bands were the Order of the Sons of Italy and the Emanuele Cosentino band. There were 2 Catholic churches and 4 Protestant. There was St. Joseph Orphanage, and one of its founders, Achille Corbo, also lobbied successfully to have Italian taught in schools where the demographics justified it. The Madonna della Difesa school was trilingual. There were at least 10 Italian language schools. Kids had summer camps, a daycare, and activities. There were groups for women, youth, and war veterans. A cultural institute, and a variety of local activities were all very much a part of the times. The Italian colony was vibrant and very well integrated into Montreal, and generally they were accepted for the contributions that they had made. In Italy, Mussolini was dealing with social unrest. He was getting approval from the international press because he showed himself to be a decisive leader who gets things done. The governments, all 3, were sympathetic towards the fascists for their own reasons. For Canada, the communists and the anarchists were dangerous, and it saw fascism as a way of maintaining order. Many of us remember Gentile Dieni as the leader of the band that continues his legacy today. Gentile was a fascist organizer and led the summer camps for boys. His brother Antonio ran the restaurant that was here at the Casa d'Italia. His daughter Marcella explains her father's political point of view. My father was a nationalist. Before he immigrated here in 1926, he saw the disorder that Italy was in after World War I with the communists, the strikes, and even in the village, the strikers tried to take over my grandfather's cantina and told him not to sell wine. So my father saw Mussolini as the savior of Italy, and he respected authority. He wasn't against the Canadian government. In fact, he became a Canadian citizen. Marcella's comment tells us how her father's stance was in favor of order and not anti-democratic. After Mussolini invaded Ethiopia, the RCMP stepped up their surveillance. They judged disloyalty according to who you know and what group you belong to. The force set up a network of informants who listed people. The problem was that the lists reflected the resentment of the informer. In fact, the Canadian government was interning those whom the informants told them to arrest. My question is, if these groups truly posed a threat, why weren't they declared illegal rather than spying on them? Why did the government wait until June 12th to declare them illegal? Now this is a critical question because the members of the clubs were never warned that their participation could be seen as a national threat. And this makes me think that what mattered was the act of interning Italians as a group, rather than judging the individual. It was the perception and not the reality that mattered. The internees had a right to have their case reviewed by a commissioner from the Minister of Justice. They were brought to the courthouse in handcuffs. This degraded them further. Some had to wait a very long time before they could appear. The reason was because the government needed time to build a case. They really had no evidence against them. The media aggravated the situation by attaching the notion of enemy to the word Italians. There was no effort, from what I've seen, for the media to present a balanced story. For example, there was no mention that about Italian Canadians serving the Canadian war effort. Dr. Esteldi had this to say: "I have to state that the newspaper articles were more venomous against the Italians than they were a year earlier with the Germans. They spoke with hatred towards the Germans, but they treated us with disgust and contempt, and they accused us of being traitors." Now, these definitions of us and them just added to the discrimination that already existed. Newspapers painted Italians as traitors, and this attitude shaped popular opinion. Romano Salvadori had this to say: "People were fanatic. In Lachine, people would stand on their verandas and call us spies, dirty dogs. Kids were told not to play with me because my father was a spy. They would say that we were hiding plans behind the wallpaper in our living room and that we were transmitting messages to spies." Now, Romano's father, Luciano Salvadori, founded the Saxonia Food Preserving Company, and as a vice president, he earned enough money for his family to enjoy a privileged lifestyle. After his release, Saxonia would not hire Luciano back. He found a job as a night watchman at a locomotive company in the East End. After 3 weeks, somebody said that he was a dangerous man and he should not be working in a place that was building tanks for Canada. He was fired. He did odd jobs as a salesman and eventually opened a grocery store in Lachine. Romano remembers that the discrimination was very humiliating for his father. The custodian of enemy property was set up by the Canadian government and took charge of the assets belonging to the internees against their will. The problem is that they represented both sides, the government and the internee, and that didn't work at all. They sold property and assets, often below market value, and then they would send a bill to the internee for having taken care of their transactions. This complicated the lives of the families. The women were already at a huge disadvantage. For example, at that time, it was common to have large families. The man was the sole breadwinner. They had just lived through the Great Depression, and that made it very difficult for them to save money. Discriminating programs discouraged the hiring of ethnics. Women could not sign a lease. Bank accounts were in the husbands' names, and wives could not access them. There was no unemployment, welfare, medical, or social services offered. The Italians who bought insurance from groups like the Sons of Italy could not collect. On June 10, 1940, the groups were all shut down. The Casa d'Italia was sequestered, and the network of assistance vanished. When you add fear into the equation, divisions are created. Families, friends, and neighbors are afraid to help the wives of the internees for fear that they could be interned themselves.